March 1967. The sun had not yet risen over War Zone C when the helicopters of the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, pushed through the morning haze on 19 March 1967. Their rotors carved long scars of turbulence into the humid air. As they descended toward an elliptical clearing near a thread of water known as Suoi Tre. The men in the belly of the aircraft could not see the ground yet, but they could feel the change. The subtle shift in gravity that told them they were leaving the sky and entering someone else's territory. Lieutenant Colonel John A. Bender, commander of 322 Infantry, sat rigidly, helmet, tilted slightly forward, eyes scanning the incomplete map folded in his hand. The clearing had been described as sparse woodland, surrounded by defoliated edges. A quiet spot, intelligence said. A suitable place for a temporary fire support base. Nothing unusual. But War Zone C had a way of lying. As the first stick of helicopters hovered low, the men could finally see the ground. Reddish earth, thin trees stripped by chemicals, and a silence thick enough to make the hair rise beneath their helmets. They were not alone. They all felt it before they understood why. When the skids touched down, the jungle erupted. 5 remote detonated charges, perfectly timed and well hidden, exploded across the clearing. One detonation lifted an entire helicopter sideways, slamming it into the dirt like a kicked toy. Another eruption engulfed a Huey in fire. Pilots cursed, infantrymen bailed out into the red dust, and rotor blades scattered debris like shrapnel. 3 helicopters were destroyed outright. 6 more were damaged before the rotors had even stopped turning. 15 men were killed, 28 wounded, and the base did not yet exist. Bender tasted bitterness on his tongue. This was not an ambush triggered by frightened guerrillas. This was a welcome party, a message, a reminder that this patch of ground belonged to the 272nd Regiment of the 9th Division, a Viet Cong unit known for discipline, organization, and the rare audacity to fight in broad daylight. On paper, this landing zone was supposed to be the birthplace of Fire Support Base Gold, a hub for artillery that would support the broader Operation Junction City. The mission, search and destroy, sweep and clear, push the enemy out of Tai Ninh province. Simple, in theory, and yet the very earth beneath their boots already felt hostile. Beside Bender's battalion, the 2nd Battalion, 77th Artillery Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel John William Vesey, Jr., landed their batteries in staggered sets. Vesey was a man carved out of discipline. He had built his reputation on precision, logistics, and calm under pressure. Even he blinked in disbelief as another delayed VC mine detonated against Company C, wounding 5 infantrymen. And still, the mission continued. Throughout the afternoon, more helicopters attempted to reinforce the raw, torn clearing. The final wave brought in 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment, whose landing drew more fire and more damaged aircraft. The clearing felt less like a foothold and more like an open wound. But by sunset on March 19th, Fire Support Base Gold existed. Ragged, fragile, imperfect, but real. The calm before the storm. March 20th passed in thick heat. The soldiers improved what little perimeter they had. Shallow foxholes, a thin strand of wire, and rough emplacements for the 105mm howitzers. The ground was hard, the air wet, and the sense of being watched constant. FSB Gold sat roughly 90 kilometers northwest of Saigon, close to the center of War Zone C. Only 3 kilometers away during Operation Attleboro a few months earlier, the Viet Cong had tasted defeat at Ap Cha Do. The 272nd Regiment had been there, had lost, had pulled back, had recovered. And now they were back. That evening, as the dim light filtered through the skeletal trees, Bender studied the terrain. It was an oval clearing with open flanks, no trenches, no deep structure. It was a place where 400 men could be surrounded with ease. Vesey's artillery crews dug in the guns of 277 artillery. 18 howitzers formed the backbone of the base, each one capable of hurling high explosive shells miles into the jungle. Their job was simple: support the infantry and break any enemy assault. But even a powerful weapon becomes vulnerable when the enemy is close enough to touch. As night fell, men tried to rest, though very few slept. 21st March, 1967, 0430. A patrol from Company B, operating outside the fragile wire, reported movement, shuffling, quiet pressure in the brush. And then, just as suddenly, the sound stopped. 2 hours passed. The jungle exhaled nothing but heat. At 6:30, the patrol began to pull back toward the perimeter. No one knew that, in less than 60 seconds, the largest concentrated Viet Cong assault many of them would ever experience was about to fall on FSB Gold. The first mortar struck near Company B's command post. The second landed outside battalion headquarters. Then all hell opened. Mortars, 650 rounds of 60mm and 82mm fire, began pouring into the clearing. The sky turned into a sheet of descending flame. Men dove for cover that did not exist. Radio men tried to speak, but the air vibrated too violently for words to form. The world became noise and shrapnel. Within 5 minutes, the patrol outside the wire was overrun. Every man killed or wounded. Inside the perimeter, recoilless rifles joined the attack, along with RPG-2 rockets and an ocean of small arms fire. From the northeast and southeast tree lines, waves of Viet Cong infantry emerged. Hundreds at first, then more. Dark silhouettes against the rising sun. The assault was timed with terrifying elegance. Machine gunners of B Company shouted over the din as their positions buckled under pressure. Entire platoons were being squeezed inward. "Push them back!" someone yelled. But there were too many coming too fast across too small a space. The artillery crews of 277 artillery fought to fire back. Mortar counter-battery fire illuminated parts of the jungle, but the distances were shrinking by the second. At 7 o'clock, the first Forward Air Controller, FAC, arrived overhead, weaving in tight arcs to direct airstrikes. 2 batteries from nearby fire bases brought their 105mm guns to within 100 meters of Gold's perimeter. Dangerously close. At 7:11, B Company announced the worst possible news. First platoon has been overrun. The perimeter was collapsing, and the infantry charge had only just begun. The line begins to break. The moment Company B reported that its first platoon had been overrun, the shape of the battlefield changed. What had begun as a mortar storm was now a rolling tide of infantry, surging out of the tree line like a living organism. The Viet Cong of the 272nd Regiment were not probing for weaknesses. They were driving directly at the heart of fire support base Gold. With the precision of men who had planned every step, the men of Company B, responsible for the eastern side of the perimeter, were now fighting in a shrinking crescent of earth. Their foxholes spat dust and smoke. Magazines emptied faster than hands could reload. The enemy moved in disciplined waves, using the fog of dust and smoke as a cloak, and all the while the mortar barrage continued. At the command post, Lieutenant Colonel John A. Bender tried to regain control of the radio net. He could barely hear his own operators through the hammering roar. Calls overlapped, requests for ammunition, reports of casualties, warnings of penetrations in the line. The perimeter was dissolving. The southeast buckles. At 7:50, Company B's commander sent a desperate message. Request beehive on the southeast and south. It was a drastic measure. Beehive rounds, 105mm canisters filled with 8,000 finned steel darts, were meant for point-blank combat for moments when the enemy was close enough to smell. Firing them toward friendly lines was a dangerous gamble, but the alternative was letting the southeast fall completely. Lieutenant Colonel Vesey acknowledged the request. Artillery crews from 277 Artillery lowered their howitzers to near-zero elevation. The sound of a beehive round leaving the barrel was not a normal artillery blast. It was sharp, tearing, like a massive sheet of metal being ripped in half. The first volley hit the advancing Viet Cong at close range. Bodies fell in rows. The earth erupted into clouds of shredded vegetation and dark soil. But the pressure did not stop. The north begins to crack by 8 a.m. The northeastern section of the perimeter was under another concentrated infantry charge. Company A, positioned on the west side, attempted to shift men to help, but the distance and the enemy's volume made coordination nearly impossible. At 8:13, Company B's 1st Platoon sector, already devastated, came under renewed attack. Ammunition was nearly gone. The men were fighting with what little remained: grenades, rifles with partial magazines, and whatever courage they still had. At 8:15, a small, exhausted element of Company A, who had been running an ambush site outside the wire overnight, broke through the enemy cordon and sprinted back into the camp. They slipped through chaos and smoke, diving into defensive positions just seconds before VC fire took the ground they'd crossed. Their arrival provided a thin sliver of reinforcement, but the line was still disintegrating. The quad mount falls. At 8:25, a report came over the net. Northern perimeter penetrated, enemy inside the wire. A machine gun crew manned an EAM, 45 quad mount, 4.50 caliber guns mounted together. One of the most terrifying weapons on any battlefield. The quad mount had the power to cut trees and men alike in seconds. The Viet Cong knew this. RPG-2 rockets streaked across the clearing, trailing spirals of smoke. One struck the quad mount's emplacement. The turret erupted in flame. The crew was knocked aside, some killed instantly, others thrown bleeding into the dirt. When the VC reached the weapon, they attempted to turn it toward the American center. If they succeeded, the base could be swept clean in minutes. But a gun crew from 277 artillery, only 75 meters away, saw what was happening. With no time to think, they fired a 105mm round directly into the quad mount itself. The explosion destroyed the weapon and the Viet Cong trying to seize it. It was a brutal decision, but a necessary one. If the quad mount had fallen into enemy hands, everything inside the base would have become a target. The last defensive line. By 8:40, the eastern, northeastern, and southeastern defenders had fallen back to a secondary perimeter, a tight horseshoe around the artillery pieces. The western, northern, and southern defenders were still holding, but barely. VC forces were now within 15 meters of some positions, and grenades were being traded at ranges of 5 meters near the battalion aid station. The artillery guns, unable to fire overhead without hitting friendlies, depressed their barrels even further. They were now firing beehive rounds directly into human beings they could see. Vesey's men had become infantry in a matter of minutes. Shell after shell, they tore gaps into the advancing ranks, but every gap filled with more bodies. The air grew thick with smoke, mud, blood, and steel darts that hummed through the clearing like angry insects. Air support at danger close range. At 700 hours, the FAC had begun directing airstrikes. But by 8:45, the situation had become so desperate that airstrikes were being called in within 50 meters of American lines. Bombs fell along the wood lines. Napalm roared across the treetops. The FAC's voice crackled with urgency on the radio, then suddenly cut off. The FAC had been shot down by automatic weapons fire. For a moment, the battlefield felt abandoned. No eyes in the sky, no direction, just the unfiltered violence of two forces locked at arm's length. But the pilots continued striking from memory of the last coordinates. The air above the tree line roared with explosions. Below, the artillery crews expended the very last of their beehive rounds. When the final canister casing clattered empty, they switched to high explosive shells, firing them at point-blank range. The earth shuddered with each impact. Despite all this, the enemy kept coming. Reinforcements fight. Through the 3rd Brigade had already alerted its other units to return. The 2nd Battalion, 12th Infantry, along with the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Infantry, mechanized, and the 2nd Battalion, 34th Armor Regiment, began moving back toward FSB Gold from the west and southwest. They had to cross a stream, one with only a single feasible crossing point. The bottleneck slowed the rescue force to a crawl, even as the men inside the fire support base were being squeezed tighter and tighter around the artillery. By 9 a.m., the 212 Infantry finally punched through the Viet Cong lines and reached the remnants of Company B. It was a brutal, close-quarter fight just to link up. With fresh ammunition and fresh rifles, the exhausted defenders surged outward. counterattacking toward the east to re-establish the original perimeter. Some Viet Cong who charged were so badly wounded they had to be carried by their own comrades, yet they advanced anyway. 12 minutes later, at 9:12, the mechanized infantry and armor bulldozed through the brush from the southwest. Their 90mm guns fired canister rounds at near point-blank range, tearing into the assaulting VC, who had been pressing from the eastern side. As the tanks rolled forward, machine guns sweeping the tree line, the assault finally began to crack. The Viet Cong started to break. By 9:30, the original perimeter of FSB Gold was fully restored. The Americans had survived the worst. The aftermath of fire and steel. The battle did not end simply because the Americans had restored their perimeter. War Zone C had a habit of refusing closure. Even after the tanks of the 2nd Battalion, 34th Armor Regiment smashed through the brush and began sweeping eastward, the enemy still clung to pockets of ground like stubborn roots gripping the soil. Each meter of jungle held motion, silhouettes, or the possibility of movement, and every surviving Viet Cong fighter seemed determined to turn that possibility into one last shot, one last grenade, one last charge. By 9:45, helicopters had begun descending into the clearing, kicking dust and shattered leaves into spirals. They evacuated the wounded, men burned, bleeding, deafened, or too exhausted to speak. Medics shouted over the rotor wash as they dragged casualties toward the landing zones, while still glancing nervously at the tree line. No one fully trusted that the battle was over. Out past the smoke, the armored vehicles pressed onward. Tanks and APCS fired machine guns and canister rounds at retreating clusters of VC. Artillery from nearby fire bases continued pounding, suspected withdrawal routes. Airstrikes hammered positions deeper in the jungle. The fighting continued in bursts until nearly noon, when the final pockets of resistance slipped away into the dense green, leaving behind a silence broken only by engine noise and the groans of the wounded. A clearing turned graveyard. By the time the smoke thinned, Fire Support Base Gold no longer looked like a military installation. It looked like a meteor impact site. Scarred earth, shredded timber, artillery pits half filled with ash, and craters still warm from explosions. Men began counting bodies. The official tally would record 647 Viet Cong killed, 7 prisoners captured, along with 65 crew served and 94 individual weapons recovered, including 50 RPG-2 launchers, their tubes still warm in some places. The numbers far exceeded what many soldiers believed possible. It felt unreal, as if an entire battalion's worth of men had evaporated beneath the weight of firepower. On the American side, the losses were sobering: 36 killed and 190 wounded. 36 men who had landed 2 days earlier in helicopters now lay still under ponchos. Hundreds more were being pulled into evacuation helicopters. Yet the casualty ratio, more than 20-1 in favor of the Americans, would be heralded by headquarters as proof of a decisive victory. Proof that Fire Support Base Gold had been worth the effort. Proof that Operation Junction City was working. But the men who walked among the bodies thought differently. Gunners from 277 Artillery, some of whom had fired beehive rounds at enemies less than 20 meters away, stared silently at piles of torn foliage and dark shapes. Infantrymen from 322 Infantry moved through the debris of their own destroyed foxholes, stepping over broken rifles, ripped web gear, and blood-stained earth. There was no cheering, no sense of triumph, only exhaustion and something else, a recognition that they had survived something engineered to annihilate them. Evidence of planning. As the area was searched, American intelligence teams recovered documents, maps, notes, and orders that showed the Viet Cong had planned this assault extensively. The 272nd Regiment, supported by elements of U-80 artillery, had studied the clearing, rehearsed movements, mapped artillery pits, and prepared to execute a rare daylight attack, a testament to their confidence and discipline. In the days before the assault, they had infiltrated close to the perimeter, dug firing positions for recoilless rifles, emplaced mortars, and prepared multiple waves of infantry. Some reports indicated that the VC carried wounded comrades into battle during later charges, proof of their determination to break the line no matter the cost. The Americans looked at the battlefield and saw a trap sprung too late. The Viet Cong saw the same field and knew their gamble had failed, but not in vain. They had forced the Americans to reveal something: their overwhelming reliance on firepower and the vulnerability created when an enemy got close enough to negate it. The artillerymen and the president's citation. In the days that followed, word of the battle radiated outward through the command structure. The violent defense of FSB Gold, the stubborn hold of the infantry, and the near-suicidal bravery of the artillery crews became legendary inside the division. Years later, 3 U.S. units would receive the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism. 2nd Battalion, 34th Armor Regiment, Spady, 2nd Battalion and 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, die 2nd Battalion, 77th Field Artillery. Lieutenant Colonel John William Vesey, Jr., the artillery commander whose men had lowered their guns to fire beehive rounds at point-blank range, would be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest American military decoration. It was the formal recognition of a man who had kept the guns firing when the enemy was practically breathing the same air as his crews. For the infantrymen of 3/22, the memory of Vesey standing amid the chaos, coordinating fire, pushing ammunition, shouting orders, refusing to fall back became a touchstone for the rest of their tour. But even the medals could not tell the full story. Living with what remained. On the afternoon of the battle, bulldozers moved slowly through the clearing. Their wide blades pushed bodies, some tangled in the wire, some scattered near the artillery pits, some slumped in shallow depressions, toward mass burial sites carved into the red earth. The soil was hard, and the number of dead too great for individual graves. Men who had survived the worst of the assault now found themselves performing the cold, mechanical task of clearing the field. The weight of it settled into their bones. It stayed with them. Later, some of the gunners from 277 Artillery would admit that they dreamed not of the fighting nor of the explosions, but of the cleanup. The sound of bulldozer blades scraping earth, the thud of bodies shifting beneath steel, the smell of burned grass and fuel long after the fires had died. Fire Support Base Gold had been a killing ground for 4 hours. It would become something else entirely in the quiet that followed. A victory that echoed strange. When senior commanders arrived, Colonel Marshall B. Garth, brigade leadership, and eventually higher echelons, they saw statistics that validated their strategy. The body count was enormous. The weapon cache was impressive. The enemy regiment had been shattered. The Americans had held. Operation Junction City, they believed, had proven its worth. But for the men who had fought it, the meaning was more complicated. Yes, they had survived. Yes, they had stood their ground under impossible odds. Yes, the tactical victory was overwhelming. But the cost, mental, physical, and emotional, could not be measured in ratios, and the enemy they had defeated today was not gone. The 272nd Regiment, though mauled, would regroup, recruit, and reappear less than a year later during the Tet Offensive, as aggressive and determined as ever. What had been destroyed at Suoi Tre was not the regiment itself, but only its present shape. The war would go on, and the jungle would absorb the scars of this fight as it always had. Quietly, gradually, almost indifferently. An oval clearing in Tay Ninh province would return to farmland. Grass would grow where artillery pits once stood. Rubber trees would rise where tanks had rolled, but beneath the soil would remain tiny reminders of that morning. Steel darts, shell fragments, bones. The ground remembers what people try to forget.